All right, Mr. Smith. So we have already been looking at Genesis, but there's about to be a shift in the narrative in Genesis. Can you talk to us about what's coming?
Right. So far we studied Genesis 1 to 11. And at this point, God has been dealing with all of creation and all of humanity sort of at once. But God is going to shift and start to deal with one particular family, a nation that he founds called Israel. It's formed out of the descendants of one particular person that God comes to, a guy by the name of Abraham, first called Abram. And he's going to make a very special nation. And he is not going to lose sight of his original covenantal promises that we've seen going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Because in Genesis chapter 12, verse number 3, God says, I'm going to, through you, Abraham, all families of the earth will be blessed. And we're going to really emphasize that passage and see how the great covenantal promises that God makes to Abraham are really just a fulfillment and the next step in sort of this revelation of how God is fulfilling his redemptive promises, ultimately the work and the person of the Messiah.
And so as he calls Abraham, we're going to get more particular in terms of the kind of society God wants to see on earth and wants to see created. And so this is going to lead to the establishment of some principles, guidelines, laws, ideals for that society in particular. What stands out to you about this creation of that society? What's important about that?
Right. So the nation of Israel, through the rest of the book of Genesis, as we'll study, is going to really go through some growing pains. They have these groups of leaders that we call the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And they're going to go on these adventures and misadventures. And God is going to still hold steadfastly to his covenantal promises. And then Israel as a nation is going to find themselves in a really difficult situation. They're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And God's going to release them from that slavery through the leadership of a guy named Moses. And we'll talk about this as the events of the Exodus unfolds. But as the Exodus continues, God's going to give to Israel a set of laws. And we're going to call this the Mosaic Covenant, or the Mosaic Law, named after Moses. And essentially, this is a list of a whole bunch of laws. A medieval rabbi named them at 613 laws. And the idea here is God is calling his people to live in fellowship and in community in such a way that they are reflecting the peace, the holiness, and the shalom of the Garden of Eden. They're treating all other human beings as fellow image bearers of God. And although it's going to be imperfect, and although the people are going to very rarely fully follow this law, if ever, God is still calling them to do that and calling them to live a life that is different and set apart because they are a group of people who are different and set apart.
Now, at the same time, while we're going to look at the Israelites, there are some other peoples who are developing, of course, their own systems of ethics. Are we going to look at any of those, and how do those compare to the laws set forth by the Israelites?
Right, so we're going to study in this unit pretty extensively the ancient Egyptians. And as we're doing this, we're going to be really focusing on the main question for this module, which is what is justice? And the way that we're going to eventually wind up really focusing on this is looking at some of the great Egyptian law codes as well. We're going to particularly focus on something called the 42 Negative Confessions of Ma'at, which is in the journey to the afterlife, a soul had to make these confessions and say, I have not done this, I have not done that. And if they pass the test, they earn their way into the Egyptian version of the afterlife, of heaven. And what we're going to really do is focus on the biblical definitions of justice and living well in a community and compare that to the Egyptian analog and how they focus on living well in a community. And this really gets back to our core question of what is the good life for human beings? What does it mean to be human? And so the way that these cultures and civilizations have defined and answered these questions has also defined and organized their civilizations. And we're also going to tag on a third group. We're going to look at the law codes of Hammurabi from ancient Mesopotamia and Old Babylon. And we're going to do sort of a three-way comparison between these three great civilizations and how they've answered these enduring questions.